Dry River Wash, Arizona Territory, late winter, 1882. The wind ran cold through the cottonwoods and rattled a loose strand of fence wire like a spoon against a tin cup. If you're settling in with us tonight, do me a kindness before we ride. Tap like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. All right, saddle up. Silas Glay didn't come for scenery. He was counting loss. 3 yearling steers through a broken post, tracks slanting into an old riverbed where water used to be. He rode slow because the land asked for quiet, hooves hollow on rippled dust left by last spring's flood. A hawk scraped circles into the pale sky, while February promised mercy and kept its teeth. He found sign, a scuff near shale, a smear of hair on cholla. He expected bones. He did not expect a human shape pulled tight into the shadow of a fallen cottonwood. So still the eye preferred to call it trash and move on. His mare stopped first, ears pricked, breath fogging. Silas's hand settled on the reins, not the rifle. The shape didn't stir, only wind. He swung down, boots took dust without echo. He approached open-handed, shoulders easy, the way you tell a spooked animal you mean no harm. Up close, what looked like scraps of hide were scraps of her. A torn strip of deerskin knotted loose at the hips, bare thighs streaked with sun and grit, atop shredded past decency. Ash lay on her like a verdict, shoulders, neck, chest, even her face, pressed in dark bands no accident could make. Ritual, punishment, he'd seen it once. Her breath was shallow but steady. A rib rose and fell, stubborn work of a body not ready to quit. Heat came off her like fever rather than noon. Black hair, long and snared with burned beads, crossed her mouth. She was young. Apache, no doubt. Silas knelt by the cottonwood root. He didn't touch. He didn't talk. Words were for men who needed to hear themselves. He waited until a small tremor moved her shoulder and a dry sound tried and failed to climb into speech. He shrugged out of his coat, then the flannel beneath. The wind bit, he let it. He shook trail dust from the shirt and laid it over her without skin to skin. Shoulders first, then the hollow of her chest, then down across her belly, smoothing fabric with the back of his knuckles to cover ash and cold, and the meanness someone had meant to leave behind. Her eyes opened and shut like a door tested after a storm. No plea, no flinch. Only the fact of him and that he wasn't here to take. He slid his arms under her with the care a man saves for something breakable that deserves not to be. She was light in the way that frightens all angles and heat. Her legs hung like rope. The wash kept its silence. The wagon sat on kinder ground above. He moved steady, not fast. Speed spooks, steadiness saves. He set her on an old horse blanket, pulled his shirt past her knees, added another blanket, and tucked it. All as if tucking could persuade the night to be gentle. He told himself he was still after steers. He told himself he'd circle back by dusk. He climbed to the bench, gathered the reins, and turned for home. 3 miles can be long or short depending on what you carry. The wheels sang their dry iron song. He looked back once, enough to see hair veiling half a face, a thin arm loose from the blanket, the purple at her elbow like a brand even ash couldn't quiet. He kept the team to a steady pull and watched the light withdraw from the flats. This was not gallantry, only a refusal to leave a living thing where death had been arranged for it. Mercy maybe, duty maybe. Up at his place, the cottonwoods wore early catkins, a lie of spring against a hard year. Smoke would catch, fire would hold, Water would cool cloth. That would be enough for a start. He'd lay her on the cot, stoke the stove, listen for the fever's stubborn rattle, and speak the first true sentence the day had earned. "You're safe here," he would tell the quiet, and mean it, even if meaning was all he had yet to give. Silas hadn't come looking to be anyone's savior. He was a widower with fences to mend and a ledger that stayed as weather. He believed in small, exact things: a steady knot, a mended hinge, a fire banked before sleep. But some sights take the measure of a man faster than he takes the measure of them. Under the low beam of his cabin roof, Silas moved with the same slow precision he had learned in war, and never quite unlearned. Every gesture measured, every sound accounted for. The woman, this marked one, this near ghost of a body wrapped in his shirt, lay on the cot he had kept unused for years. He could see the fever riding her chest, rising in shallow tides, threatening to pull her under. He had carried her through the door like he once carried wounded comrades, though the weight was hardly there. She was lighter than a sack of feed, lighter than a winter pelt, but heavier in ways that pressed against his ribs. He stood a long moment over her before he turned to the stove, knowing the fire had gone low in his absence. He bent to it, coaxing flame out of coals, layering pine splits until the orange bloom steadied the room. The light found her face half buried in hair, and he saw the smear of ash clinging at her collarbone. A mark not of survival but of punishment. It stirred something deep in him, something colder than the night outside. He fetched water from the barrel just beyond the door, the night air cutting sharp on his bare arms, shirtless still after giving what little warmth he had to her. Inside again, he poured into a tin basin, dipped a cloth, and wrung it tight. When he touched the rag to her forehead, her whole body flinched, not from cold, but from reflex, the kind born of long fear. He froze, his hand pulling back as if burned. "You're safe here," he muttered, though the words were less for her than for the silence pressing at him. He tried again, slower this time, and the damp cooled her skin by degrees. He stayed there, cloth in hand, listening to the ragged pattern of her breath, the scrape of wind against the walls, the low crackle of wood in the stove. No other sound came, not from her lips, not from her throat, only that faint rattle of lungs refusing to quit. Silas set bread wrapped in cloth by her hand, though she could not take it yet, and he brewed coffee out of habit, letting the bitter smell cut through the air. He thought of the fence posts that had broken, the cattle scattered somewhere out in the brush, the work waiting at dawn. It did not matter now. Work could be caught tomorrow. Tonight, there was only this: keeping a stranger alive because leaving her was unthinkable. He sat back in his chair, boots heavy on the floor, hands wrapped around the tin mug, watching her stir once, twice, small sounds clawing up from her chest like cries trapped in sleep. He knew the kind of sound. He had made it himself 17 years earlier, on a battlefield in Virginia, when smoke cleared and the men who had eaten with him that morning were gone by afternoon. A sound not from the throat but from the place beneath ribs, where grief lives when there is no room left to bury it. Hours bled out. He stretched a wool blanket near the hearth, laid his coat for a pillow, and settled on the floor. He could not bring himself to take the cot across from her, not when she might wake to a man looming close. He kept his distance, but not so far she'd be left defenseless. Every time she coughed, his eyes snapped open. Every scratch of branch against timber, had him sitting upright, rifle instinct gnawing at his reach. Still, he stayed on the floor, letting the fire warm him enough to keep his eyes heavy, but never closed all the way. By dawn, the fever had not broken, but she was still breathing, and that was a victory he had not counted on. When he stepped out to feed the horse and shovel the manure, the air was brittle, snapping against his lungs. He thought of the steers still missing, of chores stacked higher than daylight hours, but his mind kept returning to the cabin, to the fragile line of her ribs, to the way she had not opened her eyes except that one flicker in the wash when he covered her with cloth. He hauled in wood, split kindling, moved steady as always, but his chest felt different, stretched in a way it had not for years. When he came back in, he left a tin cup filled with water near her hand, set bread beside it, and went about his tasks in silence. He did not try to rouse her, did not demand thanks. Survival was enough. Hours passed before he returned from the barn again, sweat cooling on his neck, hay clinging to his sleeves. He stepped inside to warmth and stillness, only to find the cot empty. His jaw tightened, but he did not panic. He scanned the cabin once, twice, until his eyes found her crouched in the corner, blanket pulled around her, his shirt loose at her shoulders, hands clenched around the cup he had left. She was drinking in shaky gulps, cheeks flushed from fever but eyes sharp now, tracking him like a doe that has learned men bring both danger and salvation. She had not run. She could have, weak as she was, but she hadn't. That fact lodged itself inside him heavier than any wound. He moved toward the table slow, deliberate, sat down, pulled jerky from his coat pocket, and laid it at the edge. Then he turned to the torn harness he had been meaning to repair, hands working leather with quiet rhythm. When he glanced up again, the bread was gone. She hadn't spoken, but she had eaten, and something inside him unwound just a fraction. He didn't smile. Men like him had long forgotten the shape of that expression. But something in his chest shifted, not loud, not sudden, just enough to mark the hour. For the days that followed, words stayed scarce, but meaning thickened in the silence. She kept close to walls, moved like shadow, paced at night as if expecting enemies to burst through the door. Twice he found her crouched by the threshold, clutching the blanket like armor. She never asked who he was, never asked why he had helped her, never asked where she was, but she had not left, and that was something Silas did not press. He moved steady, kept chores simple, fed the horse, hauled wood, mended gear. Every action was slower than usual, each gesture calculated not to startle. He was not used to company, but he was willing to learn the weight of it again. He did not know her name, not yet. He figured if she wanted to tell him, she would. And one afternoon, while he was slicing jerky, and she was crouched near the fire-sewing spare cloth into some loose form of a garment, she whispered it soft, as if testing the air. "Sa." He looked up, met her eyes for the first time. She did not repeat it, did not explain, only bent her head back to the needle in her trembling hands. His voice, rough with disuse, gave it back to her. "Sigh." The fire snapped between them. She nodded once, small, but it was enough. In that instant, the silence changed. It was no longer exile. It was beginning. The fire burned low that evening, the cabin lit by lamplight and the steady rasp of Silas's knife across a strip of rawhide. Saia sat on the floor near the hearth, her knees drawn close beneath the linen shift she had fashioned from his scraps. The fabric was uneven, threads pulled taut and crooked in places, but she wore it with a quiet pride that needed no apology. Her hair was damp, freshly braided down her back. Small beads darkened by fire worked again into the ends, as if she had decided her past was not to be hidden, but carried forward on her own terms. Silas watched her without letting his gaze linger too long. He knew the weight of being observed when a body carried too many scars, and he would not put that burden on her. Still, something had shifted since the moment she whispered her name. It was as though a door long barred in both of them had creaked open just enough to let breath through. That night, when he stretched out on the floor near the fire as usual, she did not stay silent. She rose from the hearth, walked across the room, and stood over him, her shadow falling across his chest. He did not move, only looked up, waiting. She knelt, slow, and her fingers brushed the scar just beneath his ribs, tracing it lightly, as if she needed to know what kind of wound had marked him. "I know what it feels like," she whispered, voice low, more confession than conversation. Her eyes found his and did not waver. Silas's breath caught, the old ache of memory pressing hard behind his ribs. He reached up carefully, touched her wrist with his calloused hand, and she did not flinch. Instead, she leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. Not a kiss, not yet, but a joining of silence. For the first time since he had carried her out of that wash, the distance between them felt bridged by something stronger than circumstance. She stood again and returned to the cot, leaving him awake long into the night, staring at the rafters, heart unsettled but not unwilling. In the days that followed, their rhythm altered. Saya no longer kept herself pressed to corners or doorways. She moved through the cabin as though testing ownership, sweeping ash from the hearth, washing his worn shirt in the basin, laying it across a chair to dry. He did not stop her. He let her settle into the shape of the place, as if it were hers by right of survival. When he stepped outside to tend cattle or check the line of fence posts, she stayed. Each time he returned, fire burning steady, blankets folded neat, her presence was confirmation. She was no longer a rescued thing clinging to life. She was becoming someone who chose to remain. One morning, Silas watched from the barn door as she knelt by the thin stream running behind the cabin, sleeves rolled to her elbows, scrubbing root vegetables with hands that no longer trembled. The water caught in her hair and flashed in the sun. He saw the curve of her shoulders, strong now where they had once sagged beneath ash and fever. He did not interrupt. He let her work in her own rhythm. Later, she placed a bowl of stew in front of him without ceremony, then sat across the table, sipping her own portion, eyes steady on his. It was the first time he felt her gaze without suspicion. It carried something else now, awareness, maybe even acceptance. That evening, as dusk pulled long shadows across the clearing, they sat side by side on the porch bench. The wind was sharp, so she wrapped one of his coats around her shoulders, sleeves rolled high on her arms. She did not speak, nor did he, but her thigh brushed his, and she did not move it away. The warmth of that simple contact settled deep inside him, more binding than words. After a long silence, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the world seemed to hold still, even the restless cottonwoods. Her voice broke the quiet at last. "Why did you help me?" The question was not sharp, not accusatory, only raw. Silas thought long before answering. His voice came out steady. "Because no one else did." It was the truth, and the only one he had. She nodded once, and the weight in her shoulders seemed to ease, as if that answer, bare as it had been enough. Later that night, when they returned inside, She brushed her hand against his as she passed through the doorway. It was no accident. He felt the press of her touch long after, as if it had been branded into him. She claimed the cot, and he returned to his blanket near the fire. But the silence between them had changed. It no longer spoke of distance. It spoke of two people circling closer, finding a rhythm not forced but earned. Days blurred together with the new season's thaw. Snow gave way to softened ground, and light stretched further into evening. Silas caught himself listening for her footsteps the way he once listened for the wind across wire. Ek, not out of fear but habit, grown from the knowledge she was here and breathing. Saya tended to small things. Herbs hung above the hearth, shelves put in order, cloth laid across the table. The cabin smelled less of smoke and more of sage. He realized the house no longer felt like a tomb, but like a place where life had chosen to remain. It was in that softened air that she surprised him. He was fixing a split stirrup when she entered the barn and laid a small parcel wrapped in hide beside him. She said nothing, only waited. He opened it careful and found a carved figure inside, simple bone, shaped in Apache style. A woman kneeling, arms folded across her chest, head bowed in mourning, his chest tightened. "For your wife," she said softly, "for the grave." He had never spoken Clara's name to her, never explained the wooden cross behind the barn, but she had known, had pieced it together from his silences and his sidelong glances. He swallowed hard, unable to speak. Instead, he nodded once, rose, and walked out to the grave. She followed. Together, they placed the carving at the base of the cross, pine needles swept aside. Only then did he whisper the name aloud, Clara. And Saya let it rest, neither prying nor pressing, only standing with him in the weight of his memory. That evening, something between them shifted yet again. When he spilled a pinch of salt and cursed under his breath, she laughed, soft, unguarded, the first sound of levity he had heard in that room in years. He looked up, startled, and she did not hide her face as before. She met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "You curse like a soldier," she said, voice dry. He admitted it. "I was one." For a moment, truth lay bare between them, sharp as steel but strangely freeing. She nodded, no judgment in her gaze, only recognition. "I figured," she said, "you walk like one." And in that moment, Silas felt the old silence of the cabin break. Not with noise, not with fanfare, but with the simple fact of two people carrying their scars into the same firelight, no longer strangers, no longer exiles, but something closer to kinship, maybe even the fragile beginning of love. The night settled deep over the cabin, and Silas lay on his blanket near the hearth, listening to the faint crackle of firewood as it collapsed into embers. He had told her truths he had not spoken in years, and she had offered none of the judgment he feared. Instead, she had met his confessions with her own quiet understanding, a weight shared rather than handed back. That should have been enough for one night, yet something restless moved in him, something that had not stirred since long before Clara's grave. He closed his eyes, trying to ease into sleep, but the scrape of cloth against the plank floor told him she was not resting either. He opened them to see her standing in the glow of the lamp, dress brushing his arm as she paused above him. Her hand reached down, fingers light, tracing the scar that ran beneath his ribs. Her touch was not curiosity nor pity, but recognition, an acknowledgement of pain mirrored in her own body. She whispered, "I know what it feels like to be marked." Her eyes held his, and he understood she was not speaking only of the ash smeared across her skin weeks ago, but of every scar left unseen. He reached up, covered her wrist with his rough hand, and felt her steady beneath his palm. For the first time, she leaned in, pressing her forehead gently to his, the gesture neither kiss nor vow, but something intimate all the same. The joining of two silences that no longer needed to stand apart. When she moved away and returned to the cot, he stayed awake for hours, staring at the rafters, trying to steady the weight in his chest. The air between them had changed. He did not know what to call it, and perhaps naming it was not yet important. But he knew it was real. The next days unfolded in different rhythm. She no longer stayed pressed to corners, or crouched near the door as though waiting for pursuit. She began to move through the cabin with a certain ease, not ownership, not yet, but presence. He came in one afternoon to find the hearth swept clean, the table cleared of clutter, and the air sweetened by a bundle of sage she had hung above the mantel. It was a small change, yet it shifted the atmosphere of the room in ways he had not realized were possible. The cabin no longer felt like a mausoleum of one man's solitude. It began to feel like a place where life could root again. Silas let her do these things without remark. He understood the importance of letting her claim space, of building something with her own hands, rather than accepting whatever scraps survival tossed her way. He saw her shoulders straighten, her steps quiet but sure, and he recognized the power in such small transformations. Each one told him she was not merely surviving, she was beginning to live. And he, though he did not speak of it, felt a shift in himself as well. He no longer moved only out of duty, no longer tended to chores in the rhythm of endless repetition. He moved with an awareness of her presence, as though every nail driven, every plank mended, every fire tended carried a purpose beyond himself. One afternoon, he found her outside by the stream, sleeves rolled to her elbows, rinsing vegetables she had dug from the edge of the brush. The water shone across her skin, strong now, where bruises had once been. Her hair hung heavy and damp, braid trailing against her shoulder. He stood at the barn door watching, not intruding, simply absorbing the sight. She did not look up, did not need to. She was no longer the girl he had carried from the wash, fevered and fragile. She was becoming something else, whole, grounded, and undeniably here. That evening, when she set a bowl of stew in front of him, she sat across the table and met his eyes without hesitation. The silence between them was no longer wary. It was steady, weighted, and strangely comfortable. Later that week, they sat on the porch bench, watching dusk pull the sky into shades of violet and gold. She wore his coat around her shoulders, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the wind tugged loose strands of hair against her cheek. Their legs brushed, neither moved away. After a while, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let his breath fall in rhythm with hers. The question came softly, almost swallowed by the breeze. "Why did you help me?" He thought long before answering, staring out across the darkening pasture. His reply was simple. "Because no one else did." She nodded, the tension in her frame easing as though that truth, bare as it was, gave her more peace than any oath or promise could. For Silas, it was the only answer he had, and the only one that mattered. That night, when she passed him at the cabin door, her hand brushed against his. It was deliberate, not by chance. He felt the warmth of her skin long after she withdrew, a quiet brand pressed into memory. He returned to his blanket near the hearth, and she took the cot again, but the air between them was altered forever. They were no longer two strangers bound only by circumstance. They were something closer now, something not yet spoken, but already understood. The days that followed moved with the same cadence of chores and silence, yet beneath it ran an undercurrent neither could deny. She tended the fire before dawn, folded blankets with care, sewed cloth with steadier hands. He repaired fence lines, split wood, mended tack. They did not speak much, but every glance, every gesture carried weight. When he spilled salt and cursed low one evening, she laughed softly. The first true laugh he had ever heard from her. It startled him, warmed him. And she did not hide her face this time. Her eyes met, his steady and unflinching. "You curse like a soldier," she said dryly. He answered without hesitation, "I was one." That truth settled heavy between them, but not as burden. It was another brick laid in the bridge spanning the silence they had once lived inside. She only nodded, no judgment, no fear, just recognition. And in that moment, Silas realized something he had not allowed himself to hope for. This cabin, once a place of solitude and memory, was changing. It was no longer only a shelter against wind and cold. It was becoming a home again, not because he had built it, but because someone else had chosen to remain inside it with him. The fire had burned low again, shadows climbing the walls in long, uneven strokes, when Silas stretched out on his blanket near the hearth. He expected her to move toward the cot as she always did, careful to keep the small border of distance between them. But she lingered near his side instead. He felt it before he saw it. The shift of air, the brush of fabric. Then her presence loomed above him, silent, steady. She knelt slowly, her dress brushing against his arm, and her fingers found the scar just beneath his ribs. The touch was feather light, tracing the hard line of skin where an old wound had closed long ago. It wasn't curiosity or pity, it was recognition. A silent message that she too bore marks the world could not see. Her voice, soft but unshaking, broke the silence. "I know what it feels like," she whispered. Her eyes caught his and held there, dark and steady. And in them he saw not weakness, not shame, but the raw truth of someone who had lived through cruelty and still refused to bow. He reached up, his calloused hand covering her wrist, and she did not flinch. For the first time since he had carried her out of the wash, she leaned closer, resting her forehead against his, the warmth of her breath touching his skin. It was not a kiss, not yet, but it was intimacy all the same. Two silences pressed together until they felt less like absence and more like a bridge. Then she rose, moved quietly back to the cot, leaving him awake long after, staring at the rafters, his chest tight with something he could not name. When dawn came, the air between them was different. She no longer moved like a hunted animal pressed against the edges of walls. She walked the cabin with a quiet surety, touching objects, sweeping ash from the hearth, wiping the table clean with cloth. He did not stop her. He understood what it meant to claim space, to take a corner of the world and make it yours. She hung a bundle of sage above the mantel, and for the first time in years, the cabin smelled not only of smoke and sweat, but of something gentler. He sat at the table watching her one morning, knife in hand, as he shaved rawhide strips, and realized that the house did not feel as hollow as it once had. Something was filling it again, something alive, something worth tending. One afternoon, he found her by the stream, sleeves rolled to her elbows, rinsing root vegetables with hands that had once trembled, but now moved with strength. The water gleamed on her skin, catching light, tracing the strong shape of her shoulders. Her hair hung heavy, braid damp and clinging against her back. Silas stood at the barn door, watching, not intruding, simply letting the image etch itself into him. She no longer looked like the frail figure he had lifted from the wash. She looked like someone who belonged to the earth, who carried her survival with pride. Later, she set a bowl of stew before him without speaking, then sat across the table with her own cup, meeting his eyes as she drank. That moment carried more weight than words could. They ate in silence, but it was a silence without fear. That evening they sat on the porch bench together, watching the horizon deepen into dusk. The wind was cold, and she wore one of his coats, sleeves rolled high, the bulk of fabric drowning her frame, but somehow fitting all the same. Their legs touched. Neither moved away. After a long quiet, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the world stilled, as though the night itself leaned in to listen. Her voice, almost lost to the wind, carried the question that had been waiting since the day he lifted her from the dirt. "Why did you help me?" He thought before answering, staring out at the field, letting the weight of memory press against him. "Because no one else did," he said finally. It was not a line, not a comfort, only the bare truth. She nodded, and for the first time, her frame eased beside him, shoulders no longer drawn so tight. That small shift mattered more to him than anything else. Later that night, when they stepped back inside, she brushed her hand against his as she passed through the doorway. It was deliberate. He felt it long after, the warmth of her skin lingering like an ember he could not shake. She settled into the cot again, and he returned to his blanket by the hearth. But the silence between them was no longer distance. It was something shared, something waiting. The days began to blur in the rhythm of chores and firelight. Yet beneath it all grew an undercurrent neither of them could deny. She tended the fire before dawn, folded blankets with care, sewed with steadier hands. He mended fences, split wood, worked leather. They did not speak often, but each glance, each gesture carried meaning. One evening, when he spilled salt across the table and cursed low, she laughed softly, unguarded. The sound startled him, warmed him. She did not hide her face. Her eyes found his and held steady. "You curse like a soldier," she said, voice dry as desert wind. He met her gaze and answered plainly, "I was one." The truth lay between them like a blade laid on the table, sharp and heavy. She did not recoil. She nodded once, eyes steady. "I figured. You walk like one." It was a strange kind of relief, that small exchange. The words did not close distance, but they acknowledged it honestly. Silas felt a shift then, subtle but real. He no longer saw her only as the woman marked by ash and exile, nor as the fragile body he had carried into the cabin. He saw her as someone who had lived her own battles, who had scars enough to recognize his. In that shared recognition, there was no pity, no demand, only the quiet acceptance of two people who had been broken in different ways and yet still endured. That night, as he lay listening to the fire crackle, he realized the cabin no longer echoed with silence. It carried weight, yes, but not emptiness. For the first time in years, he felt less like a man waiting for the land to swallow him, and more like someone who had found a reason to keep breathing. The reason was small still, fragile as a sapling in early frost, but it was rooted. And he knew, without needing to name it, that it was her. Morning light pressed through the cabin shutters in pale gold. carrying with it the sharp smell of thawing earth and the promise of spring. Silas rose first, as he always did, pulling on his boots while the fire whispered low in the hearth. Yet when he turned, he noticed she was already stirring. Saya moved quietly, barefoot against the plank floor, her linen shift hanging loose over one shoulder, her braid tied back with a strip of cord she had found in his shed. She bent to sweep the hearth before he could, her motions unhurried but deliberate, as if she had always known this space and was only reclaiming it after a long absence. He watched her for a moment without speaking. The air was different now. No longer the wary hush of strangers tolerating each other, but the softer silence of two people who had begun to find rhythm in each other's presence. He stepped outside to haul water, the morning air cutting sharp. And when he returned, she had already folded the blankets with a neatness that had never been his habit. Her presence carried order, not the stiff kind pressed by duty, but a quiet shaping of space that made the cabin feel more like a home than a hiding place. The days fell into a pattern. She tended the lamp without being asked, refilled the woodpile, and swept the corners until the dust that had clung for years was gone. At first, Silas thought of it as habit, work any woman would do out of survival. But he began to realize it was more. These small gestures were her way of taking root, of shaping a life that could not be dictated by exile or punishment. He let her. He moved slower than he once did, careful with every motion, as though she might vanish if startled. Yet she did not vanish. Each day she lingered. Each day she took another piece of the cabin into her keeping. And the weight on his chest eased in increments too small to measure, but impossible to deny. One morning, carrying a bucket of milk in from the barn, he stopped short in the doorway. She stood sweeping the floor with a pine branch broom, her new dress piece from his old shirts clinging to her frame in a way that made his jaw tighten. She noticed him, met his gaze for the first time without flinching, and held it. Not long, only a breath, but it was enough to burn itself into memory. Then she returned to her task as though to say, "I see you, and I am still here." Silas set the bucket down quietly, the beat of his heart harder than he cared to admit. It was that same day, later in the shed, that he noticed she had braided 3 blackened beads back into her hair. They had survived the fire, cracked and scorched, but she wore them now like a banner reclaimed. He said nothing, but the sight rooted in him. She was not trying to forget where she had come from. She was simply refusing to let it define her anymore. That evening, she joined him outside, carrying a bucket of her own without asking. She stood beside him as he mended a stall door, holding the board steady so he could drive the nail true. Her fingers were calloused now, her grip firm. He did not thank her aloud. Somehow he knew she preferred it that way. But when they were done, he handed her his knife and gestured toward the pile of rawhide he had left. She took it without hesitation, kneeling in the dirt to strip it into cords, her hands steady as if she had done this all her life. They worked side by side until the sun lowered itself into dust and gold across the plain. No words passed, but none were needed. Inside that night, she stirred the beans while he split kindling. When they sat down to eat, he poured her coffee without asking. She took it and in the pause between bites leaned forward to reach for the salt tin. Her neckline slipped slightly, revealing the soft slope of her chest. His eyes caught it by accident and he froze. she noticed. Her hand paused on the tin. Her gaze flicked to his. This time, he did not look away. He held her eyes steady, not with hunger, but with the quiet truth that he saw her. After a moment, she set the salt down and resumed eating, as if to say, "We will not run from this." He let the silence settle, not heavy but charged, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir in him that was not grief. The next morning, it was she who poured the coffee first. That evening, when the day's labor was done, she came out to the porch and sat beside him on the bench, not across from him, not at a distance, but close enough that her leg brushed his. The breeze caught her braid, loose strands brushing his arm. She folded her hands in her lap, eyes on the horizon. Neither spoke, but the air between them thickened with meaning. After a long while, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and his chest tightened at the weight of her trust. "Why did you help me?" she asked, voice quiet but steady, carried into the dusk. He thought long before answering. "Because no one else did," he said. Simple, unpolished, but true. She nodded, and he felt her relax against him, the rigid line of her shoulders softening for the first time. He did not tell her about Clara's grave behind the barn, or the silence that had haunted him since that first winter alone. He did not need to. In that moment, his answer was enough for them both. Later that night, when she brushed his hand as she passed through the door, it was no longer accident. It was choice. He felt it long after she pulled away. She claimed the cot, and he returned to the floor by the fire, but the room no longer held two strangers. It held two souls, learning slowly to breathe in the same rhythm. And by morning, Silas knew, without speaking it, that whatever had begun in the wash was not chance. It was something worth protecting. Something that, for the first time in years, made him believe the days ahead could carry more than duty. They could carry hope. That night, the air inside the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Silas had stretched out on the floor by the hearth as always, boots set aside, coat folded beneath his head. He expected the familiar rhythm, her moving to the cot, the quiet of firelight between them, the long hours of silence that had become their language. But instead she lingered. He sensed it first as a pause, the weight of her presence standing above him, the hem of her dress brushing his arm. He opened his eyes to see her watching him, face steady, unreadable in the dim glow. Then, without hesitation, she knelt. Her fingers, careful but deliberate, touched the scar at his ribs again, tracing its hard edge as though learning its shape. Her eyes lifted to his, and her voice came low, a whisper cut from the marrow of truth. "I know what it feels like to be marked." Her words carried no pity. They were not a question. They were recognition. He swallowed, the memory of battles and graves pressing against him, and raised his hand to cover her wrist. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned forward until her forehead touched his, her breath warm, her closeness undeniable. It was not a kiss, not yet, but it was something more binding than silence, an understanding that passed between them without need of speech. When she drew back, she did not retreat far. She returned to the cot, but the air in the cabin had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It pulsed with the knowledge of what had just passed, fragile but real. Silas lay awake long into the night, staring at the beams overhead, heart carrying a weight he hadn't felt in years. It was not the burden of grief, nor the sharp press of duty. It was something new, something unsteady but alive. In the days that followed, that change deepened. Saya no longer pressed herself to the edges of walls, nor moved like someone half expecting the door to burst open. She began to claim the cabin with quiet confidence. Each morning she tended the hearth before he could, swept dust from the corners, folded blankets with care. She found order in small things, and through her hands, the cabins softened. The stale air of solitude lifted, replaced by the faint scent of sage bundles she tied above the mantel. Silas noticed but said nothing. He let her root herself in the place however she needed. And with each passing hour, he felt his own steps lightening, his own routines shifting to meet hers. One morning he came in from the barn carrying a pail of milk and stopped in the doorway. She stood at the center of the cabin, sweeping the floor with a pine branch broom, her patched dress clinging at the waist. She looked up, met his gaze, and held it without flinching. It lasted only a heartbeat, but in that moment something unspoken tightened between them. Then she returned to her sweeping, as if to say, "I see you and I'm still here." Silas set the pail down quietly, his chest drawn tight with something he could not name. Later that afternoon, while repairing a loose board on the stall door, he felt her presence again. She stepped forward unasked and held the plank steady so he could hammer the nail true. Her hands were firm, fingers calloused now from work. He didn't thank her, not because gratitude wasn't in him, but because he understood she didn't seek it. Instead, when the job was done, he handed her his knife and pointed to the pile of rawhide. Without question, she knelt in the dirt and began cutting it into strips, her motions practiced, her posture sure. The hours passed in a silence that was no longer strained but full, the kind of quiet two people can share without losing themselves. That evening, when they ate together, something shifted again. She reached for the salt, her neckline slipping just enough to reveal the soft curve of her chest. His eyes caught it, and he froze. She noticed. Their gazes locked, neither looking away, neither shamed. It was not hunger, not embarrassment, only truth, the truth of seeing each other wholly, stripped of walls. She set the salt down calmly and resumed her meal, and he let the silence speak for them both. The next day, it was she who poured the coffee first. That evening, after chores were done, she sat beside him on the porch bench. Her leg brushed his, and again she did not move away. The wind combed through her hair, and after a long while, she rested her head against his shoulder. Silas did not breathe too deep for fear of disturbing the moment, but his heart beat harder, steady in its unfamiliar rhythm. When her voice came, it was low, but it cut straight through him. "Why did you help me?" He thought long before answering, staring across the darkened pasture. His reply was simple, stripped of any polish. "Because no one else did." The words settled between them like an oath. She nodded, her frame easing against him, as though that truth, plain as it was, gave her more comfort than any vow. That night, when they stepped back inside, her hand brushed against his as she passed the door. It was deliberate. He felt the warmth of it long after. She took the cot. He returned to his blanket, but the distance that had once been between them was gone. They were no longer strangers, surviving under the same roof. They were two souls, marked by scars and silence, beginning, slowly, carefully, to weave a life together. For Silas it was a revelation. He had once believed his days would stretch into endless repetition, fences, cattle, and wind through the eaves. But now, when he looked across the firelight and saw her curled in his shirt, eyes no longer wary, but watchful with intent, He knew that the land had given him something more than duty. It had given him her. And though neither of them spoke it, both felt it. What had begun in the wash was no accident. It was the fragile beginning of something worth protecting, even against the world itself. The days stretched longer with the thaw, light lingering into evening, and with it the rhythm of the cabin shifted into something steady, almost domestic. What had once been silence born of fear or grief was now silence filled with routine, two people moving around each other as though they had shared the space for years. Silas found himself listening for her footsteps, the way he once listened for the creak of fence wire in the wind, not from suspicion but from the quiet assurance that she was near. Saya tended the fire before dawn, her hands skilled in coaxing flames from ash. She laid fresh cloth across the table, folded his shirts into the crate he had used without order, and tucked herbs she had foraged above the hearth, so the air smelled faintly of sage. When he walked through the door at midday, the cabin no longer looked like a place carved out for survival alone. It looked lived in, claimed, softened. He did not comment. He did not need to. The changes spoke for themselves. That morning, Silas sat on the porch, sharpening his old skinning knife, hat pulled low against the glare. He could hear her working behind the cabin, the steady scrape of a hoe breaking soil. When he glanced over, she was bent at the garden bed, her patched dress clinging to her back with sweat. He caught the slip of her strap against her shoulder, the smooth line of her collarbone exposed in the light. She felt his gaze but did not flinch. She only paused, then kept working. That single moment carried a charge stronger than words, an acknowledgement that the air between them had changed. What had once been avoidance had become awareness. Inside the cabin, too, the difference was clear. Shelves once cluttered now held neatly stacked tins. The hearth was swept daily. The cot bore folded blankets, no longer tangled. These small adjustments brought a kind of order that had been absent since Clara's death. And though Silas said nothing, the truth settled in him. This was no longer his house alone. Saya was shaping it in her image as much as his, and he found himself strangely grateful. It was after lunch when she surprised him. He had been crouched in the barn, mending a split stirrup when she appeared at his side. In her hands was a small parcel wrapped in hide. She said nothing, only set it gently on the ground beside him. He looked at her, weary and curious, then opened it slowly. Inside lay a carved figure, bone whittled into the shape of a kneeling woman, head bowed, arms crossed in reverence. His chest tightened. "I made it," she said softly. Her voice was sure, steady, carrying weight. "For your wife." "For the grave." He froze, breath caught in his throat. He had never spoken Clara's name aloud to her, never explained the wooden cross behind the barn, or the way he avoided looking at it when he passed. But she had known. She had read the signs, the silence, the shadow in his eyes, and pieced the truth together. His hands closed over the carving, rough against smooth bone. He swallowed hard. Words failed. Instead, he rose to his feet and walked towards the grave. She followed without sound, her steps matching his. They stopped at the edge of the mound where pine needles had drifted thick across the earth. Silas knelt, brushing the needles aside, setting the figure carefully at the base of the cross. He stayed there a long moment, head bent, shoulders tight. Then his voice came, low, rough from disuse. Her name was Clara. It was the first time he had spoken it in years. Saya said nothing more. She only stood beside him, hands folded before her, letting the name settle into the air without intrusion. Later that evening, the cabin felt lighter somehow. When Silas spilled a pinch of salt across the table and cursed under his breath, she laughed, a soft, unguarded sound that startled him more than any thunderclap. He looked up, caught between surprise and something warmer, and saw her smiling faintly, not hiding her face this time. Their eyes met, steady, unflinching. "You curse like a soldier," she said, voice dry with quiet amusement. His answer came without thought. "I was one." The words landed like iron on wood, hard and undeniable. For a moment, the silence that followed was heavy. He had not spoken of that life in years, not to anyone. He wasn't proud of it, the scouting, the trails cut through Apache land at Union command. But before he could regret the admission, she nodded once. "I figured," she said. "You walk like one." The exchange was brief, yet it shifted something deep. There was no judgment in her tone, no recoil from the truth he carried, only recognition. For Silas, the weight of his past did not lessen, but it no longer felt like a burden he carried alone. She had seen his scars, spoken to his silence, and now she had looked into the shadow of his history without turning away. That, more than anything, told him where they stood. That night, as the fire burned low, she hesitated near the cot. Silas lay on the floor, blanket drawn over him, expecting her to snuff the lamp and settle. Instead, she moved toward him, her steps slow, deliberate. She stood above him for a long moment, dress brushing his arm, then bent down. Her fingers traced his scar again, softer than before. When her eyes met his, they carried no fear, only knowledge. "I know what it feels like," she whispered once more. This time, the words carried deeper meaning, not just the memory of wounds, but the truth of endurance. He reached up, touched her wrist, and she leaned closer, pressing her forehead gently to his. It was not a kiss, not yet, but it was the promise of one, the space between them filled with unspoken understanding. When she drew back, he let her go. She returned to the cot, but the air had changed again. Silas lay awake, listening to her steady breathing, staring at the beams above. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone in that room. For the first time, he wondered not just how to survive the next day, but what it might mean to share it with someone else. And though he did not dare name it yet, the truth was clear. Something fragile, but powerful, had taken root between them, and it was growing. The night after she pressed her forehead to his, the air between them carried a weight neither tried to escape. Silas lay awake long after the fire dwindled, listening to her breathing from the cot, steady, alive, and close enough that each rise and fall seemed to echo in his own chest. By dawn, he rose to the rhythm of chores as he always did. But when he returned with the first armload of wood, he found her already tending the hearth. She knelt in the glow of the rekindled fire, her hair braided back, her patched dress hanging loose at her waist. For the first time, she looked not like a guest in his cabin, nor a shadow of exile clinging to survival, but like a woman who had chosen to stay. The sight struck him harder than he expected. He set the wood down quietly and let the truth settle in. His life was no longer his alone. The days that followed bore proof of that shift. She moved through the cabin with quiet ownership, washing his shirt in the stream, laying it across the chair to dry, sweeping the floor without being asked. He did not stop her. Instead, he found himself watching the ease in her movements, the way her hands no longer shook when they worked with cloth or hide. One morning, he stood at the window and saw her kneeling at the water, sleeves rolled to her elbows, rinsing root vegetables she had gathered near the brush. The sun caught the curve of her arms, the damp cling of fabric against her waist. She did not glance at him, yet somehow he knew she was aware of his gaze. She no longer needed to hide. That afternoon, when she set a bowl of stew in front of him, she did not retreat to her corner. She sat opposite him, elbows resting on the table, cup in hand. Her eyes met his and held, calm and unflinching. Silas ate slowly, feeling the shift as surely as he felt the heat from the fire. The silence between them was no longer a gulf. It was a thread stretched taut with meaning, fragile but strong. He set his spoon down halfway through the meal, leaned back, and let the moment wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt not only fed but shared with, and that small truth sank deeper than he could explain. It was later on the porch that her voice carried the hardest truth. They sat side by side, sipping coffee, the sky painted in the dusky hues of late winter turning towards spring. Her braid brushed against his shoulder as the wind shifted, and after a long silence she spoke. "Your people," he said quietly, words half thought, half fear. "They might come looking." She paused, her cup still in her hand, her eyes on the horizon. "No," she said, voice steady. He didn't press, but she went on anyway. "They made a choice. I made mine." Her tone carried no bitterness, only clarity. Whatever rules had been broken, whatever bonds severed, she did not regret it. Silas nodded slowly, accepting her truth as final. Later that week, she surprised him again. He was repairing a split stirrup in the barn when she walked in carrying a small parcel wrapped in hide. She knelt beside him, her movements deliberate, and set it down without a word. He unfolded it cautiously, and inside lay a carved figure, simple, bone-whittled, shaped like a woman, kneeling with arms across her chest. His throat tightened. "I made it," she said softly. "For your wife." For the grave, Silas froze. He had not told her Clara's name, had never spoken aloud the grief that lived behind the barn, where a wooden cross leaned against time. Yet she had seen it, understood it, and honored it. He held the carving in his hand, calloused fingers tracing the lines, and for the first time in years, he felt the crushing silence of loss ease. Without words, he rose and walked to the grave. She followed. He cleared the pine needles from the mound, placed the figure at the base of the cross, and finally whispered her name was Clara. Saya did not ask more. She only stood beside him, head bowed, letting the name breathe again. That evening, something had lifted. At supper, he spilled a pinch of salt and cursed under his breath. She laughed, low, soft, unguarded. He looked up, startled, and she met his gaze with a faint smile. "You curse like a soldier," she said. He answered without hesitation, "I was one." The words fell heavy but honest. She nodded. "I figured. You walk like one." The exchange was simple, yet it struck deeper than any confession he had given in years. His past, scarred and bloodied, was not met with judgment but recognition. For a man who had carried silence like a second skin, it was the closest thing to absolution he had ever known. That night, when the fire dimmed and the lamp burned low, she did not move immediately to the cot. She stood above him again, her dress brushing his arm. He looked up, expecting hesitation, but she bent down instead, her fingers finding his scar once more. Her touch lingered, her eyes steady. "What they did to me," she whispered, was meant to break me. He covered her wrist with his hand, his voice low but steady. It didn't. She leaned in then, pressing her forehead to his, and for the first time she kissed him, slow, warm, unhurried. It was not desperation, it was choice. When she pulled back, she lingered close, whispering, "You never asked what they did to me." Silas swallowed hard. "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted." She nodded. "I don't want to, but I want you to know this. What they took wasn't mine to give." He understood. Her voice carried more than the words. It carried truth carved by pain, survival, and defiance. He cupped her face gently, and in that moment the distance that had clung between them since the wash collapsed. She had chosen to stay, and he had chosen to let her. What they built from that choice was fragile still, unspoken, but it was real. That night she did not go to the cot. She led him to the bed instead, fingers guiding, eyes watching, every step deliberate. There was no ceremony, no promises spoken, only the quiet act of two people deciding, at last, not to be alone. By morning, when Silas woke with her curled against his chest, hand resting on his scar, he knew something had shifted forever. The man who had once believed his life was nothing but fences, cattle, and silence now held in his arms, a woman who had been cast out, marked by ash, and yet had chosen to remain. And in that choice, both of them found what they had long thought buried, the courage to begin again. Spring deepened into early summer, and the land around the cabin seemed to echo the quiet transformation taking place within its walls. The grass thickened along the fence lines, turning from brittle brown to a deep, living green. The creek behind the barn, once nothing but a thin trickle, ran steady now, carrying with it the sound of renewal. Each morning the sun rose earlier, spilling warmth across the clearing. And with every passing day, Silas and Saya wove their lives more firmly together, not as strangers bound by chance, but as two people who had chosen to stay. What had begun in silence and fear now carried the rhythm of belonging. The sapling behind the cabin became her daily ritual. Saya knelt by its base, brushing dry soil away from its roots, pressing water from the pail with careful hands. To Silas, it was more than a tree. It was proof. It was the quiet sign that what they tended together would not only survive, but grow. He would watch her from the porch, arms folded across his chest, seeing the way she bent close to those new leaves as if they were sacred. And perhaps they were. After all, hadn't both of them been near death only months before? And yet here they stood, making life where none had been promised. One cool morning, she stepped out onto the porch with something wrapped in cloth. Her braid hung straight down her back, tied with blue thread she'd chosen on their trip to town. Her face held a softness he hadn't seen before, a quiet glow that came not from fever or firelight, but from within. "I made something," she said, handing him the bundle. He wiped his palms on his trousers before taking it, unfolding the cloth slowly. Inside lay a shirt, small, carefully sewn, the stitches tighter than her first attempts, the fabric patched but strong. Too small for him, too small for her. He looked up, eyes searching. Her voice came steady, though her fingers fidgeted at the hem of her dress. "It's not certain yet, but I think it is." His breath caught the weight of her meaning sinking into him with quiet force. "You sure?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, eyes glistening but not afraid. "I missed one moon. I feel different. My body tells me for a moment the world narrowed to just them, the cabin, the porch. the small shirt between his hands. Silas reached forward, his hand settling on her waist, the other pressing gently against her stomach. She covered it with her own, holding him there. Neither spoke for a long while. Then he leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead, then her lips. His answer was simple, but it carried the weight of his soul. Then we'll raise them here, together. From that day, the cabin carried a new kind of warmth. It was not just survival, nor even the fragile closeness that had begun in winter. It was the steady thrum of a future being built. She rose with the dawn, moving with quiet determination, her hands busy with cloth, herbs, or soil. He worked the fences, chopped wood, tended cattle. But now each task felt less like a burden carried alone, and more like preparation for something larger. They did not speak often of what lay ahead, but the truth lingered in every glance, every brush of fingers as they passed tools or shared meals. Life was no longer a hollow duty. It had become a promise. When they rode into town together, it was the first time in nearly a year Silas had been seen with anyone at his side. The people of Briar Hollow noticed. Their eyes followed Saya, her dark skin, her Apache features, her patched dress. Whispers stirred, but Silas walked beside her without pause, his arm brushing hers as they entered the mercantile. He bought flour, tools, and seed. She chose ribbon, thread, and a pair of soft-soled boots for walking. No one said much aloud, but the message was clear. She was with him, and she had chosen to be. On the ride back, she leaned against him in the wagon bed, wind pulling at her braid. "You don't regret this?" she asked softly. "All the things people might think?" Silas kept his eyes on the road, his voice steady. "I regret not meeting you sooner." She closed her eyes at that, resting her head against his shoulder, and let the truth of it settle into her bones. That evening, as the sky turned orange and pink, she brought out the copper ring, the one that had once belonged to Clara. She slid it from her finger, placed it in his hand, and held out her own. "You never asked," she said. He looked at her, long and steady, then slid the ring onto her finger again, this time with purpose. "I don't need a preacher," she whispered, "just you." His answer came without hesitation. "Then you have me." No vows, no audience, no church. Only a man and a woman standing barefoot on their own land, dirt beneath their nails, peace in their bones. That was their wedding. The next morning, she stood in the doorway with her hand resting over her stomach. He came up behind her, sliding an arm around her waist, his hand joining hers over the life they now shared. Behind them, 2 chairs sat side by the fire. Outside, the sapling had sprouted 2 new leaves, a home, a family, a future, built not from saving but from staying. Silas had once believed his life ended with Clara's grave, that the years ahead would be nothing but fences and silence. Saya had once been cast out, marked with ash, left to die alone in the desert. Yet here they were, remaking what the world had tried to take. In their quiet way, they had carved out a truth stronger than any law or judgment, that love, once chosen, could turn exile into belonging and solitude into life. And as summer pressed its warmth across the land, they stood together at the threshold of the cabin, watching the horizon, not with fear, but with hope.